Two of the candidates for 2nd District Congress, incumbent Republican Jim Ryan and Democratic challenger Dan Lykins, answer questions from district voters and host Bob Beatty and Mark Peterson on Election 02, tonight at 7 on KTWU Channel 11.
Hello, I'm Jim Lara. We need to be productive citizens, providing a place dedicated to the free flow of ideas with programming that informs, enlightens, and enriches our lives. That's why I support PBS. I hope you will too.
Next time on ExxonMobil Masterpiece Theater's The Forsyte Saga.
I'm damned if I'm doing another stroke of work for you. When I agree a price, it's what I expect to pay.
You must know I love you.
I'm sure you do not love your husband.
I loathe him.
Can't you see what I feel for you? Are you blind?
God, good beating bring you to your senses. Let's go.
Tonight at 8 on KTWU.
We are great television and more. Serving viewers in Kansas and Missouri, this is KTWU Channel 11 Topeka and K30AL Channel 30 Iola, Fort Scott, Chanute.
This is Election 02, 2nd District Congress. Tonight's guests are incumbent Republican Jim Ryan and the Democratic candidate Dan Lykins. And from the Washburn University Political Science Department, your host Bob Beatty and Mark Peterson.
Greetings and welcome to Election 2002, a series of special programs brought to you by KTWU. The purpose of these programs is to provide you, the viewer, with what we hope is a broader and deeper understanding of the positions of the candidates for the major offices on the ballot this November 5th. Today's program focuses on the 2nd Congressional District, and we have here with us two candidates vying for that seat, Congressman Jim Ryan from the Republican Party and Dan Lykins from the Democratic Party. As is our policy at KTWU, we did invite the third person who will be on the ballot this November 5th, Mr. Art Clack from the Libertarian Party. However, Mr. Clack declined to participate. I'm Bob Beatty, your co-host, and I'm joined by Mark Peterson. We are both faculty members of the Political Science Department of Washburn University. Before we begin, I'd like to give a brief overview of what we'll be doing in this forum. We decided to do what I assume the two candidates here have been doing, go out into the 2nd Congressional District and find out what issues are on the voters' minds. In the end, we came up with 6 main topics. These include the process of running for Congress, or put another way, what's the point of your candidacy? The second topic is one on many people's minds, a possible U.S. war in Iraq. The third is education. The fourth is the general welfare of Americans, especially concerning the elderly, the homeless, and the issue of health care. The fifth topic is the economy, and the last topic concerns arts and culture. Now, we may not get to all of these topics in our hour-long discussion, but we'll certainly try. Mark, would you like to help us out with the first topic?
Sure, Bob. As Bob said, we went out through the district over the last week and captured voters in the wild and asked them to ask the two candidates here questions that might be of interest to them. There's an old saying in politics, I don't care what you say, just be sure you mention my name. Some of the initial questions that we got dealt specifically with that. Let's take a look at those clips now.
My question is, who is Dan Lykins? Never heard of him. Everybody knows Ryan from, Run Ryan. He's got a long history, he's got a good past, he's got a good running campaign. That motto stands out for a lot of people. They know the name, but don't know the name Dan Lykins, don't know what he stands for.
My question for Dan is, how do you get Jim Ryan to take your race seriously? I've met with Dan, seems to be a really excited guy running for Congress. How do you get the public's attention against a high-profile incumbent?
My question would be, are you running to accomplish something or to partake of the pension plan?
So, Dan, name identification and an image in the public's mind are essential to running a race for incumbency or pulling off an upset. What have you done, and what are you going to do to make an imprint with the public?
Well, as far as who is Dan Lykins, I've lived in Topeka, Kansas for 33 years. I graduated from Washburn Law School in 1972 and decided to stay in Topeka and practice law. I've been mainly a consumer attorney. One of my big areas of law is representing victims of drunk drivers. I've had a lot of those cases over the years. I've been real active in a lot of victim issues. I've been active in the Kansas Head Injury Association, been active in the Community Eye Care Trust Fund, a lot of organizations that I think would help my clients that I've represented over 30 years. As far as, who is Dan Lykins, a lot of people don't know him. I think anybody running against an incumbent is going to face that. My cousin, Jim Slattery, he's my honorary chairman. When he first ran for Congress, nobody knew him either, and he was running against an incumbent. But he won. I think what the voters really are interested in is more what you stand for, where you came from. And, and the reason I'm in this race, probably the key reason is on July the 9th, that was the deadline to file, the last day to file. Redistricting allowed us to file late. So I got over there the last day. I thought about it a long time. I really wasn't sure, should I run? But that morning, there was something in the newspaper, and I took it with me. And there were two things. One was the word of the month in the Topeka newspaper, Justice. And the second thing in the newspaper was a picture of David Wittick of Western Energy testifying at the Kansas Corporation Commission, in which he testified over 132 times. I either don't know, I don't remember, I'm not sure. I, like many people in the 2nd District, have been very, very disappointed with certain CEOs that have taken advantage of the public. The Enrons, the Arthur Andersons, the WorldComs, that have hurt people, I mean really hurt people. And one of the, I think the poster boys in Kansas was David Wittick of Westar. The huge outlandish salaries and bonuses he was taking, over $19 million, yet the stock was going down, he was laying off people. It just wasn't fair. And I heard a lot of Westar people tell me what's going on over there isn't fair. So I finally decided I'm going to do something about it. I don't think Congress was doing anything about it. I checked to see what Congress had done to stop this corruption, and they're the ones that started it. In 1995, and this is before Congressman Ryun was elected, a bill was passed in Congress called the Security Reform Act. Basically what it did, it gave the Kenneth Lays of Enron and the Arthur Andersons a license to lie. They gave them the opportunity to do what they ended up doing, cheating and lying and stealing from the public. And Congress passed this law. Now, this law in February of this year came up for repeal. We could have done away with that law and hopefully not have any more Enrons. It was not repealed, and I'm very, very upset with that. If I'm elected to Congress, I'm going to vote to repeal that law so we don't have any more Enrons and don't have any more Arthur Andersons. But that's why I'm running.
Yeah, I think we'll be getting back to that certainly in this 1 hour. But Congressman Ryun, you're asking for another 2 years. We are assuming it's not just for the pension, but why do you?
Well, there are some of the same reasons, Bob, I ran for to begin with. First of all, it's a great privilege to serve all of the 2nd District, Southeast Kansas, Northeast, all of the counties that I have. I go all the way to the Oklahoma border, Baxter Springs, up to Atchison, out to Manhattan. I have 3 major military installations, and I must say that it's been a tremendous privilege to continue to serve these people. And actually, when I go into the cities, sometimes my wife, Ann, goes with me. And when she's not with me, I'm often greeted with, "Congressman, we're glad you're here, but where's Ann?" So I know that she's been welcomed a great deal in the district as well. I went to Washington. I asked for the confidence and the votes of Kansans to begin with, because I felt that we needed more Kansas values back there, more family values, reduction in taxes, more reform in terms of regulations, a strong hand in terms of keeping the government responsible. Congress, at least the House of Representatives, is known as the People's House. And it is just that, an opportunity as I travel throughout the district on my frequent visits. I go into town hall meetings and I visit with people and carry their concerns back to Washington and continue to represent them in a way I think they'd like to have their voices heard.
Your incumbency status has put you in a situation where your margin of victory has been fairly strong the last 2 times that you've run. How do you feel about the challenge that Mr. Lykins has posed in this election? Are you getting a good debate going in the constituency?
Well, I believe that I am. I know one of the questions that was asked earlier with regard to the race is very simple. I learned something as a young athlete that whenever you have a race, it's a race. So, you know, Mr. Lykins and I are out competing for the vote, and I'm back campaigning, have been every occasion. I come back 2 to 3 times a month, sometimes more. Again, making sure that I'm in touch with the constituents and able to carry their concerns back. So, you know, we've worked on a number of things. I know that one concern he has is one concern I have, corporate accountability. And we addressed this issue through the Financial Services Committee, beginning with a number of hearings, and then last April, we passed a tough corporate accountability law that would bring greater burden, if you will, would bring the CEOs into greater penalties, and cause them to have to respond in a way that make them, you know, in a sense, make them more responsible to the people. It went to the Senate, it came back, we even strengthened it to the extent that we made the penalties in prison longer. We even are going after their assets, so that if they have fraudulently cooked the books and it can be proven, that we will actually go get their assets and return them to the investors. And since this process has begun with the Enron scandals, we've had 29 convictions. So the process sometimes is slow, but nevertheless it's working. And I think in conjunction with what we've done in Congress, as well as what we saw vividly on TV as some of those CEOs were carted away by federal officials, has sent the message, you cannot cheat, and if you do, these are the penalties that go with it.
Dan, has Congress done enough on the question of corporate accountability and also the question of how are you feeling about the discourse in the district itself? Are you getting out, meeting the constituents? Are resources enough to enable you to do that?
I've been to every county. There's 26 counties. I've been to every newspaper, from Joplin, Missouri, that sells a lot of papers in southeast Kansas, to Pittsburgh, to Iola, to Chanute, to Fort Scott, to Hiawatha. I've been to every newspaper. I've kept newspapers up to date. I've had a lot of news conferences. And the answer, has Congress been responsible as far as corporate responsibility? The answer is no. The only time Congress came in this summer is when the so-called fox was already in the hen house. Congress let them in. Then after the hens are all gone, now Congress is saying we're going to be tough on the fox. Well, it's too late. They had their opportunity the last 6 years and did nothing. You know, Enron is not the first company that defrauded Americans. You know, Arthur Andersen has done it for the last 4 years. Price Waterhouse, Enron, Inclone, Quest, PeopleSoft, Halliburton, WorldCom, Deloitte & Touche, CPA firms, for the last 5 or 6 years. They've all done terrible things to their companies, defrauded the public. And what's bad about this is Congress did nothing until the big Enron scandal came up. All they did was take money from all these companies. And, you know, Mr. Ryun is a very nice man, a good Christian, but the companies since 1998 that have done the worst thing to the American public, he's received money from every one of those companies. And while they were defrauding the public, Congress was doing nothing. You know, I'm glad Congress finally did something this summer, but it was awful late. It was 6 years late.
I need to jump in there because I need to have an opportunity to respond to that. First of all, you know, the wheels of Congress turn very, very slowly. I'd like to see them turn a lot faster, but to some of the accusations, for example, that I've taken corporate money, it's illegal to take corporate money. I can't do that. I get money from individuals who agree with me on issues, and there's a wide variety of people that contribute to what I do. But I will say this, my vote is not for sale, never has been, and it's one of those things that it's, you know, I have to have time, I have to have the funds necessary to be able to refute a lot of what's going on in the district with some of the stories my opponent continues to put out.
Well, he has taken money from Arthur Andersen. I've got his records from the FEC. It shows every dime he took. For instance, in October
Dan,
this year,
you can't take money from companies.
Well, you took it from Arthur Andersen, their committee, their political action committee.
Those are individuals.
But you took money from Arthur Andersen. You can call it what you want, but right when there's a pension reform bill that you could have voted on a strong one, you voted on a very weak one that Arthur Andersen wanted. And in October of last year, when this was coming up, you took $1,500 from the Arthur Andersen Political Action Committee. You took money from Enron. You took money from Halliburton. You took money from these committees, these political action committees, and then voted on many corporate responsibility bills that was not good for the people of Kansas, but was good for these companies, especially the pension bill. You voted for a very watered-down pension bill. There was a very strong pension bill you could have voted for.
Let Congressman Ryun respond, and then we'll...
You know, I think we've made appropriate responses. You know, my opponent continues to misrepresent my record, and it's an unfortunate thing. I know as I've traveled through the district, what people have asked me is that if you get into a debate, could you discuss the issues and not have distortions? And that's basically what we're dealing with here. I hope that we can go back and talk about this. These bills that he continues to talk about that are weak, I can't remember all of them because you've got a number of them, but they're generally very bipartisan. We have over 300 votes on many of them, so that it takes both sides to pass these bills, and it has to, you know, it's a process that's been worked on. So I hope that we can continue in maybe an enlightening discussion to inform the listeners about different issues.
No, I think it's important to point out, too, that, you know, in terms of what the constituents were asking about, you know, this one was not a hot-button issue with the constituents. Admittedly, it's made the national newspapers, and it is a source of controversy in terms of the national discourse. But I think here in Kansas, I was quite honestly surprised as we went out and asked constituents what they wanted to ask about. This one didn't come up.
Yeah, and let's move on to the one that certainly came up quite a bit. Mark?
Yeah, the item that was sort of second on the list with a bullet after process, perhaps even first, but process seemed like the logical thing to lead in with, was the possibility of war with Iraq. It's a looming prospect. Congress has just passed a resolution. Last week the President signed it. It gives him fairly clear authority to act by his own lights in dealing with the problem of Iraq. Let's take a look at that video clip and see what the voters wanted to ask about.
Well, my question would be that we've spent over 50 years creating a United Nations, and what are these legislators going to do to see that that's the instrument that we would use to determine whether or not we go to war, rather than one individual? You know, we have a checks and balance system in this country, and it seems to me that Congress should be very much involved in that decision. What are these candidates going to do in that regard?
My question would be what extent either or both candidates would take to make sure all peaceful means are used before we go into war with Iraq.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. One is for Mr. Ryun to clarify how he voted on the resolution on Iraq, and Mr. Lykins to give us his opinion on how he would have voted if he had the chance.
Because our budgets are so in desperate need, how do we anticipate as a country funding a military movement in Iraq?
My question is, what happens after the war? If we go to war in Iraq, what happens afterwards?
Sounds very much as though the constituents are concerned across the board. Congressman, since you participated in the debates, what have you got to say to their concerns, both about the prospects, the costs, and what comes after?
Well, it's probably one of the more difficult votes I've taken in Washington. It was not an easily decided upon issue. I took my time. I looked at the information. I attended the hearings, many of which were classified, and you know, my concern was, first of all, we wanted to be able to present to the President and to the UN an opportunity for the resolutions to be completed. But that following that, if there wasn't a follow-through, if the resolutions were not going to be adhered to, and as the President said, if they weren't, then, and the UN was not going to enforce them, then were they really going to be relevant as a body? So I took all that into consideration. I also took into consideration the fact that as a member of the Armed Services Committee, I have seen through the hearings I've had, the field hearings I've had, the actual work with the military people, the stress that they're under right now. They're at the highest op tempo. That means that they're committed to many, many places throughout the world, to the extent that their resources and their physical resources are stretched very thin. And so having taken that all into consideration, as well as the terrorist situation in the world as we now look at it, and the growing possibility of Saddam Hussein going beyond, he already has weapons of mass destruction. He's already used chemical weapons and biological weapons. And then with the information that has become available publicly recently with regard to his pressing ahead for nuclear development, it's only a matter of time before that happens. So, you know, it was a difficult vote, but I thought it was the right vote. If we allow him to proceed as he has in the past and leave him unchecked, then, you know, we could have another situation as we had on 9/11 in which we have a terrible attack, and the response is, well, nobody saw it coming. Well, we see this one coming, and it is with great hesitation, and yet at the same time I believe it's the right vote that we offer that Iraqi war resolution with the understanding that we want to go back first and exhaust all other sources of diplomatic solutions, working through the UN, making sure that we resolve those resolutions, and should those not be completed and the inspectors not have the freedom to travel around even to the presidential palaces and explore the possibility of weapons there. If they're thrown out, if they're given limitations, that's part of what we found out before through the hearings, is that you would have various people who have escaped from Iraq that would come and say, well, while we were holding you up in this area, we would move all of those particular weapon development to another area so that we had time to be able to shift everything. We need to have free and unfettered access to any kind of weapons inspection. All of that is on the table in consideration, and it is a last resort that we put our military men and women in harm's way.
Mr. Lykins, you're in Congressman Ryan's seat during this vote. How do you vote and why?
I think I would have voted the same way Congressman Ryan did. It's obvious I did not have all the information he did because he was Congress people have a little bit more information than the general public, but I think before we should send any American troops to Iraq, we should make every effort. One of the things I'd like to see is the CIA get involved more. There are groups of people in Iraq that hate Saddam Hussein more than we do, the Kurds and the Shiites. I think if the CIA works with some of these groups, hopefully they can get rid of Saddam and his leaders without American troops going in. But if we have to send American troops in, I think what's critical is the American public has the right to know what will be the consequences. I lived during Vietnam, and the government many times misled the public. We can't have that again, and misled Congress sometimes. What we need to find out is, for instance, Vice President Cheney said, if we go into Iraq, we need to make it a democracy. There's only one democracy in the Middle East, and that's Israel. I think if we're really going to do that, we're talking about billions of dollars. We're going to be there a long, long time. Is that one of the reasons we need to go into Iraq? I'm not sure, but I think the public need to know before we do that what are the options of not going in, and if we do go in, how long are we going to be there, how much this is going to cost. If we think we have budget problems now, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars. But if I'm in Congress and during this race for Congress, every time I've asked, I've told people that I don't want to make it a partisan issue. This is about the livelihood of the United States. This is very important, and that I'm going to do what's right. And right now, I would have voted the same way Congressman Ryan did.
Yeah, and this is a big issue in the district.
And Bob, I might say this, you know, there are so many different issues on the table here. As in Afghanistan, we were able to work with the Northern Alliance. You know, there are groups within Afghanistan, within Iraq we'd like to work with. Our hope is to, if and when this happens, if we have to have force, that we will take an approach as we did in Afghanistan, and that is we'll have our special forces go in. We'll end up doing some things we hope that will support what's on the ground and see what we can to do that, as opposed to putting our people in harm's way.
And let me follow up with that. Is that necessarily the right approach? Because we're starting to hear now in some articles and also cartoons in the newspaper of, well, we had that approach in Afghanistan, and we didn't get Osama bin Laden. And will he come back to haunt us, whereas could we have landed 30,000 troops, surrounded the Tora Bora Mountains, and got him?
You know, if your goal, your only goal, let's go back to terrorism, for example, is to bring Osama bin Laden to trial, I agree that's a worthwhile goal. At the same time, if you go to what's happening in Washington right now, we have a supposed sniper who is, you know, the shootings that continue to take place. It's difficult to track him. It's difficult, even more so overseas, to track Osama bin Laden. Having said that, You know, what we're really trying to do is to attack terrorism and to undermine its structure of development to the extent that we disrupt it in other parts of the world. If we get Osama bin Laden, that's wonderful. But most of all, we've got to go in and disrupt that terrorist network so that they can't continue to proliferate as they have been.
We've just this week had a new issue surface with the disclosures, rather astonishing disclosures, by the North Koreans that they actually have a weapons program. I guess the question that I'm thinking about, Mr. Lykins, is as a freshman congressman, as somebody new on the block, if you're lucky enough to be elected, how do you cope with that flow of information? What do you do as a new office holder to come up to speed to convincingly represent the constituents? As Congressman Ryan pointed out, 3 military installations in the district and seemingly a lot of concern amongst these folks that we've taped about foreign policy issues, which normally aren't thought of as congressional district sorts of issues.
Well, you know, I've been lucky. I've had a lot of friends and relatives over the years that have been in the military. I relied on them a lot over the years. I've represented a lot of people over the 30 years as an attorney that were in the military. And I've been kept up on foreign policy issues since I was a little kid. I've just enjoyed it. So I don't think I'd come in as a novice because I do keep up on it. And I know there's, you know, the U.S. can be spread so far, you know, and like you said about North Korea, what do? You know, I think maybe the answer there is, one of the things President Bush said is a blockade maybe, or make sure that no items get into Korea, but we need the help of China to do that. I think we'll have the help of Japan and the help of South Korea, but you know, there's other countries in this world that want to do evil to us. You know, Iran is one. And we have to really have a policy and a plan that we can say, this is what we're going to do if this happens in the future. And I think on 9/11, we really didn't have a policy that was foresighted enough to know, to be able to respond to something like that. Of course, that was, you know, we've never experienced something like that before, but we knew there were people out there that wanted to hurt the U.S. And I think probably one of the big problems because of 9/11, we found out that we have a lot of federal agencies that at times don't work together. They work against one another because of many things. Jealousy, they don't get along, and hopefully that will never happen again, that we'll have agencies always working together, not plotting against one another. But we are in dire straits, and you know, terrorism is something that you know, even in the 2nd District, people are afraid. You know, it's just not in Washington where there's snipers. They're afraid here too. You know, could something happen here? We have, you know, in Burlington, Kansas, a nuclear Westar owns a nuclear plant there. You know, could something happen there? So, you know, people are afraid.
But let me ask about the national interest. Members of one party seem to be very strongly behind the president, but a few years ago, a different president asked for support to go into Kosovo, and members of that same party were very reluctant. How do you define the national interest, and what's your criteria for involvement or intervention?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to trying to decide what is, as you have just said, what is a national interest. Is it really in terms of national security? And I think that the situation with regard to Kosovo and Bosnia, as serious as they were a little bit borderline in terms of national security. And it doesn't mean that there isn't a presence needed there, but I had some difficulty with that. Whereas as we look towards the potential conflict with Iraq, there are so many things that we're looking at there. We already know that we have a ruthless dictator who kills thousands of people. If you've gone just to the Kurds in the northern part of Iraq, depending on what report you read, anywhere from 50 to 300,000 have been mass slaughtered through chemical and biological weapons. We already know his track record. So because of the element of terrorism as well, you know, there is that sense that we need to go in, and if we can't do it through resolutions through the UN and other means of diplomatic resolution, then we need to, for national security purposes, have a presence there that goes through regime change. And I think that's the difference between what was going on before and what's happening now.
And do you agree with that? What criteria you would use to send in troops or intervention?
Well, you know, so much of what our foreign policy has been over the years has been economics. It's obvious there's a lot of oil in Iraq. There's a lot of oil in the Middle East. there's a lot of evil dictators in other places of the world that don't have oil, and they do bad things to their people. It seems like we don't really do a lot there. But it really comes back to economics. Okay. The American interest in the Middle East is huge, and that's one of the reasons we need to change that. We need to start not having to rely so much on oil like in Saudi Arabia. And because Saudi Arabia, even though they've, we've called them our friend for many, many years, the 17 of the 19 people that were involved in 9/11 on the airplanes were from Saudi Arabia. That's a country that have a lot of militants in it. A lot of people there don't like us, but once again, there's oil there. And when there's oil, and it's just not the Republican administration. It's been that way for a long time. Whoever's in, if it's oil, then we do things differently. We treat countries differently, and I think we need to stop doing that.
And I know Mark is anxious to get in here, but I want to follow that up with, in the 2000 election, Al Gore said that actually preventing genocide was in the national interest. Would you consider that in the national interest, Congressman?
If you're not careful, you make it such a broad approach to national security that we would be involved in everything. And yes, that's in a deplorable situation, but I have a problem with letting, yes, that's a problem, but at the same time, I'd like to use something that's more of a national security issue as a guideline.
And how about you? Would that be in U.S. national interest if we could prevent a genocide in a certain country? Should we?
Well, we've seen in Africa, not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of people murdered. And basically, we did not do a lot to stop that. We could have. I think part of that is maybe just moral values. Once again, there's no oil there. That's poor, in Africa, there's so many poor places that there's nothing there. There's no food, no oil, no resources that we need. We just kind of look another way. I believe if somebody is killing, murdering hundreds of thousands of people, then we have an obligation. We're the #1 country in the world, the strongest country in the world. We need to do something.
Perhaps the channel for doing that, though, lies with international organizations.
And I would agree with that, if I may say that. It really requires the world helping out. The United States, while it's the last remaining superpower, really can only do so much. We need cooperation and help from other countries along the way. And that's why it's such a sticky issue and a difficult issue. What my opponent has said is true. It is a very sad situation in Africa. And there are other places throughout the world that are like that. But for us to have to police everything, if we're concerned about economics, we're going to have to do a lot of tax increasing to be able to afford the kind of military budget to send all these people to all over the world.
Well, the next topic that came up, not to jump shift too radically, deals with the subject of public education. And constituents had a lot of questions there as well. It seems that in the last 30 years, possibly longer, I guess I can remember back to the Great Society and Lyndon Johnson's administration, the federal government has become more and more involved in the whole area of public education. And there have been a lot of presidential initiatives, a lot of congressional enactments, and a fair number of mandates seem to have come out of the federal government in this time period. And I think some of these questions are addressed. So let's take a look at that tape.
What about the federal government mandating testing standards and no compensation to the school systems?
As a local school board member, I'd want to know when, if ever, the federal Congress is going to provide its funding for special education as guaranteed by previous law.
My question for Congressman Ryan is, are you going to help fight for an increase in student financial aid to go with our increase in KU tuition and tuition across the board for college students?
What I'd like to know is how we can get the educational programs such as the Title I programs transferred into the private school system or have access to them so that we don't have to move our children from a parochial school to a public school just for the educational when we pay both taxes and our private school tuition.
Mandates without money is a litany that's come not only from education but a lot of other places as well. Mr. Lykins, if you had the opportunity to take the seat, what do you think you could do about the federal involvement in K through 12 education especially?
One of the most costly parts of public education is special education, and the federal government is always mandating, saying you shall do this, you shall do this, shall do that, but they're not funding it properly. But you know, they promise the states they're going to fund, like special education, I believe they promised they'd fund it at 40%. They never have. They never got close to that. The reason our education nationwide is in trouble today is all these mandates, and then the federal government not funding, and then the states have economic problems and they can't pay for it. As far as student funding, like at KU or K-State or Pittsburgh State, the other universities in our second district, I think it's very critical. I think, you know, the way I went through school was student loans. The way I went through, many people go through school student loans. And for many, many students, it's very difficult to get those loans today. There's cutbacks, there's budget cuts. Also, I think probably one of the most important things to get kids over the hump is Head Start. I'm a strong supporter of Head Start. And in the 2000 GOP budget, they cut 100,000 kids out of Head Start. I would never vote for anything like that. Congressman Ryun voted for that. And his record, by the way, I sent to every newspaper in the second district. So if anyone watching today wants to go to their local newspaper, they'll have his record on education in all the areas, where I stand on that, where he gets his money from the different places. So if they want to see it, go to their local newspapers. But on education, like on school construction, Congressman Ryun voted against funding for school construction in 2001 in the budget. On the work-study programs that are very important to KU and K-State. When I was going to law school and I was going to K-State, I was into the work-study program. In 1999, he voted to cut 112,000 students out of work-study program. I don't think that's right. As far as job training and summer employment, in the 2000 GOP budget, he supported a tremendous cut of over $300 million in that, and that hurts people. You know, maybe it's saving budget money and saving tax money, but it hurts real people, especially at the Head Start. So I think it's obvious we're having budget problems. And the federal government, if I'm elected to Congress, is going to be doing no more dictating to the states unless they're going to pay for it too. If they're not going to pay for it, we should not be dictating to the state of Kansas or any state.
Congressman Ryun?
Thank you very much, Bob. I appreciate that. There are a lot of things that I'm going to try and cover quickly.
Sure.
Let me just say this. My general philosophy on education is that the federal government, when it has responsibilities, needs to fund what it's committed to. Now, under a Democrat-controlled Congress for 40 years, they offered up to 40% of special education money, but only funded it when the Republicans took over at about 6%. We have doubled that. In fact, on the Budget Committee, we have made a full commitment to continue the full funding, in fact, complete the full funding on special education. So we're working towards that, and it's only come under Republican control. You know, as far as some of the mandates are concerned, there's some reference, I believe, to probably H.R. 1, which is the President's Leave No Child Behind. Now, I think that was a good piece of legislation when it started out, in the sense that, you know, there was a sense of wanting more accountability. If your child didn't progress along the way, then there was a sense that maybe why didn't they progress? I thought it was a good idea, but it got hijacked. And ultimately, I voted against it because I felt, one, it was hijacked, and two, it was another unfunded mandate. And as you look at what's going on the state side right now, that's been true. I know they've had education problems in terms of funding, and that's increased as well. My opponent mentioned a number of different votes. You know, some of these votes are set up so that it will appear that you are cutting education. I'll mention just one to make a point: school construction. Now, one of the reasons I voted against school construction is I think it should be a state issue, but what's written into that language is it has to be done by union workers, which is generally 20% more than it would actually cost if you put out bids. So I support construction, but I want to get the most efficiency out of it, as the most efficient type of construction as possible. So some of the votes that he mentioned were set up for that purpose, to make us look bad, but there's a perfect example of how you can make sure that you get the most for your dollar, and that's why I voted as I did.
Is there a disconnect in America, and we especially see that again in the presidential race, when presidential candidates say, I'm going to be the education president, I'm going to do this for education, this, that, and the other, And really the reality is the federal government is not going to provide vast amount of sums for education because of federalism. We'll start with you and then we'll go to...
The federal government's going to provide what it should. What concerns me is that I believe the best education is local education. In other words, let the people at the local level, your Board of Education's here, your parents have input, give them the greatest flexibility possible. We have a lot of waste with the Department of Education in Washington. Give you an example. The Department of Education has grown 87% over the last 5 years. That's a lot of money when the actual income by most people in this country is only around 19%. So if money were the problem, we would have resolved all this before. I believe that what we need to do is have fewer federal mandates, let local education groups take care of the situations because they know what best works in their location.
Did you want to ask Mr. Lykins or want to have him follow up?
Sure. Either way, if you'd like to follow up on that, but I have one observation that I would throw in, which is the last time I looked, the mandates account for, I don't think I can name the percentage of cost associated with public education, but the federal government provides about 8 cents on the dollar for K through 12 education. And I wonder if it isn't just a little presumptuous to order so much and provide so little.
Well, I think it is. I think we do need less federal control over education. I think the people of Kansas and school districts in Kansas know more than what some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. knows is going to tell us. But, you know, just getting back, you know, Congressman Ryan said these votes are taken out of context. On denying 100,000 kids the Head Start, that passed. 100,000 kids were dropped out of Head Start in the year 2000. That bill passed, and he supported it. He voted yes on it. It passed 220 to 208. That was the Republican budget. And that really did affect kids. That affected Kansas kids. When you think about it, 100,000 kids that did not go to Head Start because of what the Republican Congress did and Jim Ryan did in the 2000 budget. And those are real people. They're just not numbers.
Bob, I must respond. I'd have to go back and look at the actual vote. You know,
there it is.
You have your particular view of that vote. It's important to see what's actually in the document. I don't happen to have that in front of me, and that's my point, is that there was something in there that gave me concern that would not fit into the general guidelines that I have used, and I'm not sure exactly what. It may have involved something with school construction because they're often what we call recommits, other things that go along with these votes. So I'm sorry I can't give you an explanation on that, but I'm very much an advocate for education. And again, I have a little bit of a distortion that's been going on for some time with my opponent.
Okay, let me just follow up with a philosophical question. America, we teach in our classes that a strong cultural value is equality of opportunity. Is it necessarily fair, if we have a federalist educational system structure, that a child in an inner city school in Detroit is getting a less valuable education than a child in a suburban Lake Oswego, Oregon school? Is that necessarily fair? Mr. Lykins.
Well, you know, over the years, there's been a lot of studies, a lot of money spent, a lot of money wasted on how we can improve schools. We've had school busing. We've had all kind of, and a lot of this is federal mandates by federal judges saying you shall do this. Big busing was, you know, in Kansas City, Missouri over the years. It cost that city millions and millions of dollars, and they say the schools are now no better today than they were when they mandated the busing 20 years ago. And once again, you know, my feeling is if a child, you know, I don't care if a child lives in the slums of Detroit, Michigan, or lives in Iola, Kansas, that child deserves a decent education and the right to the best education he can get. And if you look at the 2nd District of Kansas, we have a lot of poverty here. We have a lot of kids that probably aren't getting the same type of education as other people. I just look at the city of Topeka. There's certain kids in the schools in Topeka that don't have, like, the parents' teachers associations aren't as active maybe in one part of town as the other. I think what we need to do is get parents more involved in their schools. And that's easy to say, but how do you do it? I think the teachers need to make a concerted effort. I know they have, but I think parents, if they really understood how important it is for parents to be, you know, active in their schools, I think they would be more active. And some parents have a tough time. Both parents work. You know, how are they going to be active? You know, we got to give them maybe some other ways they can. maybe we got to kind of look at the school system a little different. You know, we're always looking at it, it's got to be done this way because we've done it for 20 years this way. Maybe we need to make some changes. Maybe we need to help these little kids that are having trouble. And once again, I think one of the best ways is to start early, start with Head Start, and then after that, make sure that these kids get an adequate education, because, you know, a lot of people say that, you know, you can live in a rich part of Kansas and your education is different than some other part of Kansas. You know, I hope that's not true, but in some, you know, just on some of the grades we get, some of the results we get, it kind of looks like maybe it is. So we need, you know, Congress, the state, we need to work together and not always fight. It seems like there's too much fighting going on. Federal judges doing this, other people doing this. We need to work together to make education work better.
See, we can't agree on something. We think education is important, and I'm grateful for, you know, the dialogue here, because I think it's important that every child be equipped with the kind of education experience that allows them to go out and have a bright future. One of the things that I concentrate on when I come back in the district is I make regular stops to school districts. I appear in the classroom, I answer questions, I meet with the administrators, I let them ask questions of me, and I want to hear what their concerns are with regard to federal mandates. And of course, the biggest one that continues to come back is the whole thing on idea money. And of course, that's what we've been working on, is making sure we fully fund that. An area that, you know, Mr. Lykins mentioned, you know, why you have two parents working. Well, if you can reduce taxes, maybe one of them wouldn't have to work, and we can keep one of them at home, give them that opportunity if they'd like to have that. But I'm working on a tax credit. We'll work on increasing that will give parents an opportunity for additional expenses that come within the education system to have that as a tax credit. We're looking for ways, I'm looking for ways to ensure that we have a good experience for our young children and to give the parents the best advantage they can in making sure their child has a good education.
That makes a nice segue into the next topic, which was the issue of general welfare. As I say, we took a tour of the district and found ourselves up at Atchison one day this week, and on the Benedictine campus. I expected that we'd get lots of questions about right to life. The two at Benedictine who are on tape surprised us by having a somewhat broader range of questions, and they're matched by some folks from down the district as well. So let's take a look at that tape.
My question for the congressional candidates is what they would do to help protect human life, especially for the unborn and the aged and those in poverty, what they'll do, programs to help the human life.
I think my question for the candidates would be, what are they going to do about life? Not just abortion, that pro-life issue, but also death penalty, euthanasia. People who are on the streets, are homeless, mothers that can't feed their children because they don't have enough money, all the ranges of life. What are they going to do about that?
I am retired. I'm on Social Security. I have a good drug plan, but a lot of seniors don't, and that's a question I'd like to ask, if there's anything going to try to be done on that, because a lot of them can't, well, they just can't take what they need to take. It's either food or pills.
How are our congressional representatives going to make obtaining prescription medications easier for the elderly people who cannot afford them?
I'm somewhat concerned about what they might do in the future about getting rid of what happened during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, with all the medical effects on unborn children and our veterans. And how are they going to prevent that from occurring in the future? And if it does occur, will they pay more attention to it financially and be more supportive of our troops for serving?
I'm afraid that Nate Bukowski is a little concerned about his name, but we wanted to know, I think in looking at that, your general observations on the subject of providing for the general welfare, as it says in the Constitution.
Well, with regard to the questions that were just asked, you know, there were kind of, I picked up basically three questions. Situation of human life. You know, I am pro-life. I believe that there's a child, that child needs to have a voice, and I continue to represent that voice in Washington. Second one was regard to prescription drugs. You know, the House passed a prescription drug bill We sent one to the Senate, which at this time is dysfunctional, not because of our senators, but because of the leadership. And we're still waiting for that to come back. Now, the prescription drug bill we passed, and you'll probably hear in a moment my opponent's different view, it was one intended for the most needy so that they would not have to make a decision with regard to medicine or food. That was a $350 billion item that really gives them an opportunity to have access to prescription drugs. It is not complete. I'm hoping that the Senate will do something so it can come back, we can work that through conference, and ultimately be able to find a resolution that will advance help for our most needy seniors. The third area that I picked up on, the last one, was the whole issue of what about our vets and various things that they're exposed to. I have worked and helped veterans in our district on various issues like that. I've carried it back to the Veterans Committee, to the Veterans Department. We'll continue to do that. Actually I have the veterans endorsement for my campaign because they know the work that I do. You know, in addition to pushing for increased health benefits, we actually passed in the Budget Committee $2.8 billion above the President's request for additional health benefits, because I recognize that we've made a commitment to them and we need to follow through on that. So we'll continue to work towards that. Another issue related to veterans was concurrent receipts, recognizing that through the years that's been an issue that hasn't been resolved. It was, again, something my president didn't support, but I felt because of the work I've done with veterans that they should have that ability to be able to collect on concurrent receipts, especially for the disabled. So, you know, those are issues that I've worked on, and it's an opportunity to continue to represent interest for the 2nd District, and these are very valuable interests.
Mr. Lykins, providing for the general welfare?
Yeah, and that's probably what I hear mostly on the campaign. Prescription drugs, Social Security, a little bit about pro-life. I'm pro-life also. But on prescription drugs and Social Security, Mr. Ryan and I are like night and day as far as our views on it. Right now there's a bill in Congress that passed the Senate by a vote of 70 to 22 to make it easier to get generic drugs on the market. It's in the House right now. There's 15 House co-sponsors of the bill. Jim Ryan's not one of them. This is what the bill would do. This is a drug called Prilosec. It's used by more senior citizens than any other drug. Right now, it costs, if you'd go in downtown Topeka to the drugstore and buy a bottle of $122. If it go generic, it'd be $61. If you buy it in Canada, it's $60. Now, the people that don't want this bill passed are the big drug companies. It passed the Senate. It's right now in the House, not moving. If this passes, and all it does is tell the drug companies, once you get a drug on the market, you get to sell it for 20 years without any generic drug. After the 20 years, you can file one lawsuit, because that's what the drug companies do. They file frivolous lawsuits so they can continue to sell this drug. This drug has been off the patent for 3 years now. 20 years is over. They filed enough lawsuits that the senior citizens cannot get generic drugs on the market. When I talk to senior citizens, they say it just doesn't affect us, it affects our kids and grandkids. This bill would help everybody. The GEO of the House, House Budget Committee said this would save $60 billion over a 10-year period, $60 billion. Now, Congressman Ryan does support a $350 billion tax increase through Medicare that's going to help seniors somewhat. It's not going to help seniors' kids or their grandkids. But you know who's pushing this is the big drug companies, and that's where he gets a lot of his donations, from the big drug companies. I think we should help everybody, make it easier to get generic drugs on the market. The other thing I think is real important is Social Security. Congressman Ryan supports privatization of Social Security, putting money in the stock market. He wrote a book with President Bush's picture on the front of it by Jim Ryan after 9/11. And in this book he said if money was put in the stock market, all senior citizens today would be making about $7,000 a month. All the senior citizens could have a boat, they could have a new car, and travel to Europe. I don't think Congressman Ryan has been following the stock market the last 3 years because it's been terrible. If we would put Social Security in the stock market, Social Security would be ruined today after the last 3 years. Capers has put money in Social Security. Capers 2 years ago was worth, Kansas Public Retirement System, $10 billion. It's worth $8.6 billion today. One reason is they lost a lot of money in WorldCom. So
let me ask Congressman Ryan, you did get a free plug for your book.
You know what, and there are thousands of them out there, so it's important that they understand what really is inside of this book. I just want to make one mention of this thing with regard to generic drugs. I am not opposed to the bill. It came out July 26th, the last day we had before summer came. I am looking at it now. 3/4 of the sponsors are Republicans. I am waiting until it's gone through the process of amendment. I want to see what the final bill looks like. I'm looking for lower drug costs. In fact, I'm even supporting reimportation because there's an opportunity there for drug reduction. But this whole issue of privatization, first of all, there's never been a vote on it. I don't support privatization. I have supported a better return, and I'm glad Mr. Lykins, can I hold the book up for him?
Sure.
But this little book actually talks about the problem we have with Social Security. See, when it first started, we had roughly 40 people for every one retiree. We have 2 for every retiree now. So unless we deal with the situation, a better return on the monies that are involved, then in the year 2012 or 2013, you begin to have more people taking money out. They can actually, you don't have enough money to support them. And then last of all, in about 15 years after that, the system ultimately fails. I made a point in the book that if you had the opportunity, if you kept the money as it is now, there's really 1.7% return. If you put it in general bonds or stocks or something else, you can have a better return. But I've never taken a position. The important thing to recognize, and I'm grateful that he brought it up, is the opportunity to be able to address that there's not enough money for the seniors to come. And what he's not willing to address is if we don't have reform, either you cut the benefits or you raise taxes. And I don't think we do not have to cut the benefits, and we don't need to raise taxes, but we do need to look at reform, and that's one of the things that's talked about in this book. It's a nice little book. We've had hundreds of thousands of it gone out, by the way.
What the book doesn't talk about, though, is to leave Social Security alone. That's why you have problems today. Congress uses that money for tax cuts to pay other governmental bills, and they shouldn't do that.
I have not voted for those issues.
The money should stay in Social Security. We'd have no trouble today if it stayed there.
Regardless of privatization, what are your ideas on Social Security?
Yes,
is there
thank
a
you.
problem, and what would you advocate?
Well, I would advocate, we told people, you pay into Social Security, you're going to be able to obtain Social Security when you retire. I would never let it go any place except to Social Security. Congress, since the 60s, has always put that money, like Congressman Ryan voted for a big, huge tax reduction that helped millionaires. It came from Social Security money. Social Security Trust Fund, the money should stay there. If it didn't leave there and was only used for Social Security, we would not be having trouble with Social Security today. But the trouble is Congress has never had the guts to leave it there. They always use it for things other than Social Security.
I need to respond to that because I have not voted for monies that would be taken and used in other areas. I am a strong advocate for Social Security staying in the Social Security Trust Fund, just as you have the highway trust funds. Those monies need to stay in those allocated trust funds, and that's where there's been the distortions along the way. And I'm very disappointed because I know that, again, as I travel the district, people have said, please keep it positive, talk about the issues. We can have differences, but let's stay on course.
You know, every time I talk about his voting record, he said it's negative. All I'm talking is about his voting record, and right here, every newspaper has it. He voted to support Bush's push for Social Security privatization. This would have taken $1 trillion from Social Security Trust Fund to pay for tax cuts. So, Ryan voted in 2000. This was a vote on March the 25th, 2002, to raise Social Security Trust Fund in order to pay for governmental programs and tax cuts. He did that.
I think you're right concerning what's happened in the stock market. The issue is not really that.
And I'd just like to clarify one thing. That vote didn't take place. What he's representing is something, in fact, the Democrat National Party in many campaigns throughout this country has tried to use that, but have had to pull it because it's not factual. I have not.
It's the Republican budget. It's the Republican budget.
Mark, did you have a comment?
I did. We're getting down close to the end, but I'm wondering in this discussion if we can flip the question for a moment and ask both you and the Congressman, is there a limit to the amount of assistance that government can be expected to provide to the elderly, to veterans, to indigent individuals? Is it possible to have equality of outcome in the American system?
And we haven't done this all hour, but you have only 1 minute.
Right, we've got to limit it.
Mr. Lykins?
There is a limit. A government can't be everything to everybody. There's some people, though, the disabled, we have to help. We have to help. Children, we have to help. But there's some things, and, you know, and there's political action committees out there that want something, for, you know, and we always have special interest groups that want everything. But what we really got to look at is there's so much money to be divided among the public. We got to do, as a congressman, what's best for the general public. That's what's not what's best for some special interest group. I think that's what Congress ought to do, what's best for the general public. But when you get all this money from these big, huge corporations, that's hard to do.
I have to cut you off.
You know, we can agree on. There's a need there. In fact, one thing that and there is a certain limit. But one thing that we can do, and it's in the process of happening right now, is helping with the President's faith-based initiative to help communities and other faith-based organizations. It's another way of helping people, seniors, disabled, and I'm hoping that legislation will come out of the Senate and we can get it passed in the House.
Thank you both for coming to help inform the public, and thank you for joining us for this, the fourth in a series of programs dedicated to the notion that an informed electorate makes wise choices. We sincerely hope you'll be making your wise choice on November 5th. Goodbye.
On the rise and fall of